started with the second panel of today, which is governance best practices. I am Marissa Capodanno. I edit the publication Fund Directions, which is part of the Fund Intelligence Group. We have a really great panel. I will let them introduce themselves, I think, and let us know a little bit about their relationship and work with fund governance.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, that'd be
Okay. Bibb Strench. I'm a partner at Thompson Hine. And I have a long history at Gemini, going way back at a prior law firm. And more recently at Thompson Hine, the firm has a deep relationship. We work on a lot of the shared trusts. We also share clients that are outside the shared trust. And I lately have been focusing more on exchange traded funds or ETF funds, but I work on mutual funds and other funds as well.
I'm Stacy Luizos. I'm a partner at Drinker Biddle, and my firm represents, we're fund counsel for one of the series trusts, Two Roads Series Trust, and I also serve as independent trustee counsel to one of the proprietary advisory groups that use Gemini as well. And my background is as fund and independent trustee counsel, and virtually in any type of fund you can think about, closed end, ETFs, open end, all different kinds of open end, money market funds, you name it, and with boards and advisors of different sizes. So from a small fund shop all the way up to a very large one, which kind of I think is a nice perspective on the industry in general.
John Palancia. I'm a trustee, chairman of Northern Lights 3. I'm a trustee on Northern Lights Fund Trust 1. I've been doing this for about 6 years now. My prior career was on the investment banking side, broker-dealer and FCM operations and control and risk management.
Kevin Wolf, president of Gemini Fund Services, also president of Northern Lights 1 and 2 Series Trusts.
Thanks for being here. What we decided we'd do, since this is such a broad topic, is discuss a little bit about what constitutes an appropriate level of board oversight, and then look at a few issues through that lens. So the industry's regulators have made it pretty clear that that figuring out a better way for boards to be involved with overseeing their mutual funds is something that they're going to be looking at. It's a priority for them. And they may even be calling from the list of director duties going forward as they become outdated. So what are some of the critical issues that boards should be focusing on these days? Or that maybe your boards are looking at, or that you wish they would be looking at, wish they would know more about?
I'll start. Right now, we're probably focused on the liquidity rule and implementing liquidity. We've seen some demonstrations with the help of Kevin. I know Gemini's decided on a particular vendor to provide data. I think our challenges are, at this point, is making sure the advisor understands what their responsibility is, how they're going to use that data. And some of our challenges may be with smaller advisors who may not have the resources to focus on that. So we may have to push them a little bit. With the larger advisors, I think we'll get it and they'll put resources to it and we'll probably be okay. But I still think there's going to be a lot of dependency on what Gemini is able to produce from the vendor system.
Yeah, from my perspective, beginning to service mutual fund trust boards, you learn very early on in the process that the boardroom is not a place to ask questions, it's a place to get questions answered for the board members. Today there are a number of issues that I'm sure we'll cover. Liquidity, preeminent right now among them, where there are still really big open questions with respect to how much involvement should a board have, where do you draw the line with policy and procedure, where does it fall to an outsourced provider or service provider to step in to provide information so the board can make decisions instead of asking more questions. So certainly Gemini is moving along to prepare for all those eventualities and to be able to service, you know, the new rules under 22E4. But there are still questions that remain, and I think this is an exciting time, you know, from my perspective, hearing recently, the SEC, Dahlia Blass is actually making commentary about where to draw the line with board member responsibility, because we see it a lot. There are just numerous topics, and I'm kind of prefacing all the future conversation in this panel, but there are so many topics that are out there right now where board members really need to rely on their service providers. A lot of us in this room, service providers, right? So getting the information to the board member that they can make decisions appropriately is my role today, and that's the number one thing that I see, you know, as a challenge for Gemini and a challenge we look to answer.
I'll add one more challenge with the Ceres Trust. The last thing a board wants to do is look at and approve 80, 90 different procedures in regards to liquidity. So we're going to want some sort of standardization, as standard as we can get. Obviously, there might be some differences with products, but we're going to look for something that, a policy and procedure that can work across the entire Ceres Trust, and that the advisors can buy into.
Well, I think as part of that also, you'll be thinking about or wanting somebody to think about the type of reporting you're going to get, and I think that's something that, you know, up till now, most complexes that I'm aware of are dealing with service provider issues and starting to put together procedures and policies, but there's lots of the ongoing kind of daily business type things that haven't maybe been fully addressed yet. What's the board report going to look like? How often are you going to get that? Who's going to provide that? And you know, who's involved in administrating the program? You know, how involved is the advisor? And what's their role?
I think most boards right now realize it might be a living, breathing document, and trial and error for quite a while until we get the right formula down.
Yeah. And you know, Marissa, I know when we were prepping for this, you had put my name next to the size of, you know, is there a difference between size of a complex and what they're doing? And as I was sitting outside earlier, I started looking at the dates again and thinking about it. And as of now, the date for large complexes that everybody in this room knows is December 1st. And notwithstanding various requests of the SEC to delay that, it doesn't look like that's happening. So everybody is pretty much full steam ahead. And my experience has been with the smaller advisors is they're feeling, well, ours is in 2019, we've got a while to go. You know, I guess the expression, we're right behind you, right? So they'll, you know, kind of follow. But I think it's probably time for those folks to be thinking a little bit about this, because it's June. You know, June is, if you count, is really, you know, not so far away from December 2018 if this goes forward as scheduled. So maybe it is time to at least start having those dialogues and understanding what your plan is going forward. If you have a thought.
No, I agree with that. I think this year we'll probably start talking to advisors during our 15C process, and maybe even in between, about their readiness for this.
Or at least education.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention ETFs because they're treated slightly different under the rule, and I think a challenge for a board is that the SEC struggle with ETFs. You can tell in their adopting release, and then later their Q&A that came out, half of it involved ETFs. And I think a continued challenge for board people is just getting a comfort zone with ETFs. So, you know, if you're not understanding the lingo, APs and all that, and then you're launching into a discussion of how the liquidity rule applies to them, you know, it's easy to kind of get lost. So I think there's always needs to be kind of education on the ETFs, because they still are relatively new.
And I think you want to think about, to Viv's point, when somebody comes to you and says, I want to start an ETF, you might want to talk to them about these rules, even if they might not impact them in the short run, because there may be certain things they want to do in structuring their ETF that, you know, last thing I'm sure you know somebody wants is a year in, and all of a sudden the rule applies to them, and they say, wait, you didn't tell me that, you know, there's special considerations for in-kind redemptions, and, you know, so again, to the point I was saying before, education, and, you know, even though this has been around a while, I think now the more kind of day-to-day practical things have to be thought about.
Yeah, just in regards to education, we, in one of our trusts, we approved 4 ETFs for the first time, I believe, last November. It looked a lot like a 15C process. However, we did ask our CCO to come back to us with differences from a compliance point of view. He provided a list of compliance requirements. Said, okay, we don't see the difference because we're not compliance experts by any means from a board. Separate them, you know, regular 40 Act versus ETF, or regular mutual fund ETF. So we still need to get that. We still need to get an education on the reporting for the listed exchange, volumes, volatility, bid ask, market maker, AP, and all of this information. So while we know of those issues and areas, we don't know what it all means at this point, and reporting necessary from those areas.
In terms of that question of cultivating that expertise or onboarding that expertise onto the board versus where to rely on a CCO or a service provider, an outside expert, how are those conversations happening both with the liquidity rule and ETFs? Where does the board step in versus where are they delegating?
Well, we will be relying a lot on the CCO, but I think in addition to that, we may need a session where just we get an education on the whole process, especially around the listed exchange side of it and that reporting.
I'm thinking about the liquidity rule, just sort of jumping back to that. I'm thinking about as the December or possibly the later deadline for smaller funds, as those approach, how far along are fund groups thinking about service providers and due diligence and valuation issues? Is that are they interviewing? Are they already have someone signed up to do all of that for them, or is it still an early on process?
I'll take that first. From a Gemini perspective, we are in contract for data and liquidity classification services with Intercontinental Exchange. We are in contract, or just about in contract, with Reporting Engine. We have a rollout schedule for testing to occur well before the first filings need to be done. So from a planning stage at the service provider level, making sure we have answers for the boards that we service, we're right where we need to be. There are, at the same time, concurrently, a lot of work is being done by people like Stacy and Biv and the board members themselves, thinking about what the trust policies really need to look like. And it goes back to what I said earlier, like, where does the trust need to understand issues versus where they need to eventually approve items or ratify items, right? So those things are all contemplated in what's going into the crafting of the trust policies and procedures, and those are also being worked on now. I don't know if you want to go into more of that, Viv or Stacy.
I mean, I would say that's right, that's what we're doing, and I think that's pretty much where a lot of, not just in the Gemini complex are at this stage. In terms of some of the, as you start going through the procedures, things start popping up that are issues to think about, and, as far as valuation goes, I know this will tie nicely with your ETF discussion earlier. There's, one of the things that kind of popped out on that front is the fact that in the release, the SEC indicates that ETFs, so if you use ETFs in a fund as a liquidity tool, right, for example, in some type of international small cap or something, and you're using ETFs to invest in that part of the market, the release suggests that you actually look at the liquidity of that ETF as well. And I think that's not something that jumps out right at you when you're kind of working through the top level of the rule, but that to me is one of the things that's kind of a hidden gem in terms of that's going to be a lot of work, and it also can, I think, might change potentially some advisors' approach to how they manage those types of funds, because I've often heard in the past, we're an ETF, so that's how we deal with that. Well, again, it was something hidden within the 600 or so pages, but it's there.
And I think it's human nature too, that you're striving to get your procedures on paper and to sign up your data vendors, and you have to do all of this. But it doesn't stop there, and I think that's a point that you're making, is that you have to be thinking about, okay, how's this all gonna work? And have we assigned responsibilities? Ultimately, you're looking at a portfolio security, and you're making a classification, who's gonna have input on that. So I think when you finally finish, have all the vendors sign up and have all the procedures in place, you're not gonna be able to sit back and say, check that off. It's gonna start really getting interesting, depending on the fund. But you're right, you're gonna have issues where funds are investing into ETFs, and then you're gonna maybe have different opinions, and how do you reconcile those opinions? So it's gonna be a long road.
I mean,
I'll just add, from a trustee's point of view, trustees are going to want it as simple as possible. We approved the policy and procedures. We are going to want to see, I think, to have more exception reporting than see every report that's out there, because it just takes too much time. That's not our job. I think the liquidity manager, administrator, and the CCO together would be in control of that information, and they'd be required to report to us something that doesn't make some sense, some exception. We don't know what that reporting looks like at this time. It's just too soon.
How are people attacking that liquidity management administrator? Is that going to be the CCO at some firms and someone else at other firms, or a brand new role?
I think in Gemini it's going to be two different roles, but probably part of the NLC
Yeah.
division.
The way we're gonna, the way we conceive it right now, for the series trusts, at least, is to have it taken care of in a committee approach, similar to what might occur for fair valuation. The rub there is basically how much involvement does that committee need to have when you're reviewing liquidity classifications? Are there disagreements between a third-party data provider and the advisor itself of the mutual fund? And then how are those agreements reconciled? And then how do you memorialize that? And does the board need to see that information and that process toward reconciliation as a matter of course, because that is going to be, that's something the board needs to understand and ratify. And that's again, goes back to the way the policies will be written. And then the careful thing you want to go back to is what John just said. He wants to see, and most board members that I've talked to want to see exception basis reporting, right? So they want to see minutes and documented conversations that basically are not required, right? So you have to know when to invoke your committee approach in the face of this rule to detail out the issues, get to the reconciled answer, and be able to file your end court filing in a timely way. So to the extent that there are no disagreements, to the extent that there's no reason to convene a committee member, you basically, or committee meeting, you probably navigate your way toward a filing, and there's probably not much for the board to do but ratify the approach, right? But those are the types of things that we have to answer for, right? So Gemini is a service provider, I'm a trust officer, our job is to provide solutions for the board members. That's what they want to hear from us. So we are building that out as we speak right now, Marissa.
I think all this work, and as Bib was saying, kind of getting into the weeds and starting to construct a program is really important step, because right now, up till now, I think most of the focus in the industry has been on the buckets and worrying about the buckets and the valuation and how do you do that. But there's other things that need to be thought about as you go, like for example, the highly liquid investment minimum. How are you going to exactly set that for different funds, and who's going to do that, and how much input does the advisor have into that, and in terms of, and what are they looking at? And are you gonna have different funds from different, with different advisors that are the same type of fund, but with different HLIMs? So that's gonna, those are the types of issues. And to your point, I think it's not, the board shouldn't be wrestling in the nitty-gritty, but the folks behind you and supporting you should, need to work through all these issues, as they go. So a lot of behind-the-scenes work, but but I think it is ironic, this role, as well as, the continuing responsibilities to oversee risk management and cybersecurity, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the SEC, as you were saying, is saying that they're going to be looking at, directors' responsibilities and where can they carve it back. So it's a very interesting tension to me in terms of what they're gonna do there.
It seems like director education is definitely a common thread in some of these themes, and when we had spoken earlier to decide what we were going to talk about, we did want to touch a little bit on the cyber conversation, and definitely not to tread on the toes of our prior panel, but to Mark's question from the audience, what really is the relationship for the registered fund space, and how is it looking from a governance and oversight perspective? What are boards asking about all of these issues?
You mean crypto?
Crypto, cyber,
Cyber.
all of these
Well,
new
crypto from a
areas.
board's perspective, is it a suitable investment for a 40 Act fund? And everything that I've seen, I can't speak, I can only speak for myself. I'd have to say, I need more proof. Liquidity, valuation, custody, money laundering potential, manipulation. I think the panel before us hit upon many of the areas of concern that a trustee would raise as to whether it's suitable or not. And if we got to the point that it's suitable, the board may say, okay, a very minor, tiny piece of the assets can be invested. Sort of put a limit on those numbers, but it's gonna take a long time to get comfortable with the suitability issue.
Yeah, and I think the boards are being somewhat left off the hook by the SEC, because the SEC is very wary of cryptocurrency in all facets of it. SEC does more than regulate mutual funds, but especially since its other divisions are struggling even with issuers of cryptocurrency. They don't want registered funds investing in such instruments. So I think another way of saying that is, the boards can always kind of take a cue from the SEC, and what's worrying the SEC should be worrying board members as well.
I mean, I thought it was pretty interesting that the SEC just, there was a raft of crypto ETFs that were filed, like 10, and the SEC came back and said, don't think about registering these, and before you come back, you better look at these issues and think about them. So that's a pretty clear. I mean, you can't get much more clear than that as to where the SEC is. But what I have heard some murmurings is using smart contracts and things like that for the funds. And I saw some discussion of, and this is where the board would come into it. Are there efficiencies in using those types of currencies for your funds contracts where it may be an efficiency that the board has to consider whether it's something their fund should do? I think that's a little premature. I hear John and your reaction as I'm saying this. I think we're, and I know some do, but I think, I know Kevin, you had a thought about this and why.
Well, I think there was a question about whether or not a service provider or service providers, many among us, would ever use the blockchain for introducing a way to get everyone paid or move money or assets, and have we seen that yet? And I have unequivocally not seen that yet. It sounds interesting to me. The blockchain technology makes more sense than crypto, and to me does in general. But I think we're a ways away from that as well.
Yeah, blockchain, I think, has a lot of potential, but you need people a lot smarter than I am to figure out how to use it.
I think from a board's perspective at this point, going back to your original question, what I would counsel my boards is, it's out there in terms of, you see all the press all the time. So, at the very least, ask your service providers, are you using this in any way? Just so you understand kind of where they are. And if they are, then you have a whole host of other questions you want to check in on. I would say though, going back to your original question, I consider cyber currency, I mean, that's one thing, but cybersecurity is a very different thing. That's like, I put that in the bucket of risk management or anything like that. And, you know, I think you asked us originally, what are the big issues, you know, and I don't think they're changing very much, even though there's a few that are added to the mix. Liquidity rule, and then in my view, cybersecurity is still very much front and center because it changes all the time. So, you know, every day there's a hacker inventing a new way to cause trouble. So, you know, I know the SEC listed that as one of their exam priorities. Again, it's been 5-6 years, and so I think it's important for boards to understand kind of what's in place with their service providers, what kind of testing are they doing, what kind of education, and you know, as far as testing goes, again, that's going to always change. It's not stagnant because the technology isn't. So understanding that the folks around the fund have the proper policies and procedures in place, and also thinking about whether or not, as a board, do you want any type of formal reporting on this, or, you know, do you leave it to your CCO to come back and report? I've seen it both ways. I've seen some boards get, you know, very detailed reports. Others, you know, get a report from the CCO. But I think it's important.
Yeah, the hard, go ahead, John.
We currently, I guess, over the last year, probably escalated that a little bit with our advisors. Besides, we do, prior to a 15C review, we have the CCO review the overall compliance, which includes cybersecurity and what they've done, when they've tested, and what it looks like. None of us are cybersecurity experts or IT people. Usually, when we interview the advisor, we will ask questions in that regard and see how what their responses are. Again, none of us are experts, but they have a policy in place. They've done some testing. Everything looks like what should be done is being done. We can't help it if cyber hacks are always one step ahead of cybersecurity efforts. It just seems, so in history, it always seems that way. Some of the biggest companies and even the government has been hacked. I think if they really want to get in, they're going to get in.
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about, actually. So right now, it seems to be a culture of a lot of certifications and paperwork moving around. Board members want action items. They want to know, many times I've heard from a board, here's an issue I want to bring to the board's attention. The board wants to be able to say, well, what's my requirement? What's my action item here? And so the board, in looking at cybersecurity, will go through Gemini's cybersecurity policies. We have a great security in that area. They'll ask about our work with vendors and our primary vendors. They'll talk about intermediaries. But then, as a board maybe want to do, and maybe also should do, is they'll ask for a third-party expert to come into the boardroom on cybersecurity. And after you hear about all these certifications that are out there for cyber, from one side of the table, then the expert comes in and typically it just says the following. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when you will be hacked. So then what is the action item for the board member? They've done all they can do with respect to asking the right questions of their vendors and making sure that everyone has a good cyber policy, and there's testing that goes on around that. But then they hear right after that, it's only a matter of time before we'll be hacked. And then so the board member is saying, I'm going to be looked at by the SEC, and I've done this work to paper my review, but I also just heard that it's just only a matter of time. And I find that very interesting and a really difficult spot for a lot of board members to be in.
And I think, so that's where another thing you can add, and that's where disaster recovery, and then also kind of assessment of crisis management. You know, how would you, that would be the question maybe to ask, you know. So recognizing that it's likely to happen, you know, have you all thought about, you know, how would you react to a breach, or who would be involved in making a decision about what to do about it? I mean, that to me is the only thing you can do. You're right, Kevin. I mean, but so maybe asking those questions just to be a little more prepared when and if it happens.
Right.
I mean, one thing at least, you know, unlike ETFs and trying to have a learning curve, most board members are dealing with these issues outside of the mutual fund or ETF. I know law firms, you know, we get questions from our clients about our cybersecurity policy. So I think in this area, they can bring to the table a lot of experience and also examples in other contexts, because it's pretty much all the same issue. Somebody's trying to break through and penetrate your walls, and whether they're trying to get information from law firms, which they've done, or information about your shareholders. They're very kind of basic issues, and the board probably has a pretty good sense of what the standard should be in this area.
Thinking about bringing in like a cybersecurity expert to educate the board, I've spoken to boards who have recruited over time, and depending on what the crisis or issue du jour is, they might look for an audit expert or a legal expert for the next board member. Are boards going to start looking for a former cyber expert to join the board at some point, or is it sufficient to have an outside source on that?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and it's part of the process every year when the board looks inside and evaluates itself to see what skill sets it has, and every once in a while they decide to expand or somebody leaves. I personally would think there are other things probably on the list higher up than a cybersecurity expert, but 5 years down the road that might change.
Being part of a small board, 4 or 5 trustees, no. I think all of us at some point in our careers dealt with cybersecurity in our previous lives, part of testing, so we don't have an idea of what it's about. Are we experts? No. But if you're a large board, one of the larger complexes that have 10, 12 trustees, then maybe they have the opportunity to bring an IT expert on. But I don't think we have that with the small boards, and it's just too narrow an area. We need broader knowledge.
Apologies to the cyber experts that have board aspirations here.
Well, and I think for those folks, and like anybody who's an expert in something, when they're on a board, you have to be careful, how deep you go in the weeds. If that's what you know, you're going to be easily tempted to go down there, but then you're exposing you and the rest of your fellow trustees to more liability because you own it. So having a better, kind of more general understanding and making sure you get educated, is a completely appropriate way to handle that. I mean, to your original question, I've heard of people doing that, but I think more in risk management and kind of those types of areas. And compliance is becoming a popular
Sure.
past career for board members in some cases.
So we're about at time. Would love if anyone has any parting thoughts or any questions from the audience.
Perhaps the panel could talk a little bit, very briefly, about one important thing that board members should have is professional skepticism. Especially, it's old news with crypto and cyber, distribution in guise. Especially when you've got small advisors that maybe never managed mutual funds before. Maybe some thoughts on that.
You know my thoughts on that one.
Others may not.
I approach all things of that nature with skepticism. It's got to be proven to me before I can be sold on it. So no different than I spoke about crypto before. I'm a skeptic on crypto for 40 Act. And there are many other things I express my skepticism on, and you know that.
Stacy?
Well, it's a very timely question because just in the past day or so, a new program has been introduced where you can self-report on distribution in guise or revenue sharing violations. So you're ahead of the curve. But I agree with you, Mark. I think distribution. I could sit here. I'm sure everybody would like to do that. I'd sit here for another hour. But that's one of my. I think you're right. That's another big area still, and it's not going away.
I think it's important if you have skepticism about something to stick with it. I mean, through multiple board meetings. So, because the natural reaction is there'll be a group of people that'll try to not smooth it over, but make you feel better about it. And I've seen too many cases where something that was brought up 4 board meetings ago by a trustee later becomes a reality, and the trustee was right. So, you know, sometimes you're on an island there, you might not even have buy-in from your other trustees, but I think the most effective trustees, you know, stick with something that's troubling with them until they're satisfied.
Following up on every red flag
Right.
and the follow-up and not forgetting to, you know, there was a case a while ago where the board had found something in 15C and then never followed up and then, you know, asked for something else to address the issue and then never followed up. So then they got dinged for not following up. So, you know, I think it's hard to be, everybody wants to get along and, you know, generally have a good relationship, you know, but as Viv said, if you've got an instinct, you're all people with very sophisticated backgrounds to begin with. You know when something doesn't, you know, feel right, so always ask the questions. Boy, we're gonna have a lively meeting, aren't we?
Great, well, thank you so much for sharing all of